There is a Primarch whose name you will never find in any chronicle, whose deeds the Mechanicus has scrubbed from every data slate, whose very existence the Inquisition would burn worlds to keep buried. I found his gene-coded sigil carved into the ruins beneath the Eurasian wastes, and 3 days later, my entire excavation team vanished. The Officio Assassinorum came for me next, but by then I had already uploaded what I knew to 100 hidden archives across the segmentum. What I discovered was not merely a missing son of the Emperor, but the key to understanding why the Imperium still stands at all, and why the galaxy trembles at the edge of a revelation 10,000 years in the making. The Horus Heresy did not end the way the Imperial Cult tells you it did. There was an intervention, a singular moment when history pivoted on the edge of a blade wielded by a hand that should not have existed, and the Imperium you know today is nothing but the shadow of a lie maintained by blood and silence. The records that survive, hidden in the forbidden archives beneath the Emperor's palace on Terra itself, speak of 22 cradles that left the Genitor Labs during the Primarch Project's Genesis phase. 22 pods scattered across the galaxy by the ruinous powers in their jealous spite, yet only 20 sons returned to the Emperor's side when the Great Crusade began its long march across the stars. The official histories enumerate 18 loyal and true Primarchs standing at the Emperor's side when Horus raised his banner of rebellion, with 2 already fallen to dishonor and expungement long before the first shot was fired at Istvan. Their names were cut from the Imperial record with such thoroughness that even the Space Marine legions themselves cannot recall who their lost brothers were. The 2nd and 11th, erased so completely that their very existence became nothing more than whispered speculation among the Adeptus Astartes, a cautionary tale about failures too grave to remember. But what the Inquisition's Ordo Redactus does not want you to know is that erasure and death are not the same thing. The missing Primarchs were not killed. One of them still lived when Horus struck his blow at Istvan III and purged his own ranks of the loyalists who would not turn. One of them watched from the darkness beyond the Astronomican's light as his brothers tore the Imperium in half and set the galaxy aflame with a civil war that would consume billions of human souls and leave the Emperor himself a broken husk chained to the Golden Throne for eternity. And when the moment came, when Terra itself stood on the precipice of annihilation and the War Master's forces battered at the walls of the Imperial Palace, this forgotten son made his choice. His name, the one I pieced together from fragments of corrupted Mechanicus archives and the fevered confessions of condemned heretics who claimed to have seen his works, was Aethon. The 11th, the Emperor's vision had crafted him with a purpose singular and terrifying in its scope, a purpose so dangerous that even his father could not allow him to be revealed until the moment of absolute necessity. Where Guilliman brought structure and administration, where the lion embodied the cold perfection of military strategy, Aethon was designed to be the Imperium's ultimate failsafe against chaos itself. His genetic matrix contained something no other Primarch possessed, a psychic architecture that allowed him to exist partially outside the Materium's laws, straddling the boundary between reality and the warp in a way that made him fundamentally anathema to the ruinous powers. He was a living null zone, a blank spot in the great game of the gods, capable of severing the connection between chaos and its corrupted servants with nothing more than his presence. The Emperor had foreseen a day when chaos might corrupt his sons, might turn the very weapons he had forged against him in a civil war that would threaten to extinguish humanity's last hope. Aethon was the contingency, the hidden blade held in reserve for that exact catastrophe. But contingencies must remain secret, must stay hidden until the moment they are needed, or else the enemy will adapt and counter them before they can be deployed. So the Emperor himself orchestrated Aethon's disappearance from the records, sent him and his legion on a great crusade of their own into the dark spaces beyond the Imperium's reach, where they would wage a shadow war against chaos in preparation for the day they might be called home. The false records of his disgrace and expungement were nothing but camouflage, a lie wrapped in bureaucracy and sealed with the authority of the throne itself. Aethon's legion, the Argent Wraiths as they called themselves, in the secret cant of their classified operations, had been fighting Xenos and Chaos cults in the galactic halo for nearly a century, when word of the War Master's betrayal reached them through fragmentary astropathic messages and garbled Vox transmissions from fleeing Imperial ships. By the time Aethon understood the full scope of what Horus had done, Istvan V had already occurred. 7 legions had descended on that cursed world, expecting to crush the traitors in a single decisive blow, and instead found themselves massacred by their own supposed allies in a killing field that would come to be known as the Drop Site Massacre. Tens of thousands of loyal Astartes dead in a matter of hours, entire legions crippled beyond recovery, and the path to Terra left wide open for the War Master's advance. The journey back to the Imperium's heartland should have taken Aethon's fleet months at best, even with the most aggressive warp translations possible. But the forgotten Primarch possessed something his brothers did not: a complete and intimate understanding of the warp's underlying structure, gained from decades of warfare against entities that lived and breathed its corrupting energies. He knew shortcuts through the Imperium that even the most experienced navigators considered suicidal, paths that skirted the edges of the Eye of Terror itself and threaded between the domains of the dark gods like a knife thrust between the ribs of creation. His fleet translated in and out of the warp with a precision that bordered on the miraculous, making jumps that should have scattered his ships across light years or lost them forever to temporal distortion. They arrived at Istvan V 3 standard days after the massacre, too late to save the dead but in time to find something far more valuable. The traitors had left the system, confident that they had eradicated any threat to their advance, but scattered survivors still clung to life in the ruins of the Urgol Depression and the burned-out wrecks of the Loyalist landing craft. Aethon's apothecaries worked with desperate efficiency to extract gene seed from the fallen and stabilize the wounded, salvaging what could be saved from the catastrophe. More importantly, the Primarch himself descended to the killing fields and walked among the dead, reading the psychic echoes of the massacre that still clung to the stones like bloodstains. He witnessed every moment of the betrayal, experienced the confusion and rage of the Loyalists as their brothers turned weapons on them, felt the cold satisfaction of the traitors as they executed their ambush, and in those echoes he found the tactical intelligence he needed to understand the War Master's strategy and identify the weaknesses in the traitor advance. Horus expected resistance from the surviving loyal legions, expected that Rogel Dawn and the defenders of Terra would fortify the Imperial Palace and prepare for a grinding siege that would bleed both sides white. What the War Master did not expect was a completely fresh legion appearing in his operational sphere, a force that had suffered no casualties at Istvan and possessed no fear of his corrupted powers because they had been specifically designed to fight chaos itself. The Argent Wraiths hit the traitor supply lines first, striking at forge worlds and supply depots that fed the heretical war machine with all the precision of a surgical knife. Aethon knew that the War Master's greatest advantage was momentum, the psychological pressure of an unstoppable advance that forced the Loyalists into reactive postures and gave them no time to coordinate or reinforce. Breaking that momentum required destroying the logistical foundations that sustained it. The first major engagement occurred at Talan, where Perturabo's Iron Warriors had expected an easy conquest of a vital Prometheum production world. Instead, they found the Argent Wraiths already dug in, already prepared for the Iron Warriors' siege tactics, already equipped with countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize the Iron Warriors' traditional advantages in static warfare. The battle for Talan became a grinding stalemate that lasted for months rather than weeks, tying down one of the traitor legion's most effective forces and denying the War Master a crucial fuel source for his armored advances. Perturabo's rage at this unexpected setback was legendary, and he reportedly demanded that Horus divert additional forces to break the deadlock. The War Master refused, unwilling to slow his push toward Terra, and the wedge of distrust between the traitor Primarchs began to widen. Aethon understood something about chaos corruption that many of his brothers did not. It magnified existing personality flaws and turned virtues into vices through the subtle poison of the warp's influence. Horus had always been charismatic and ambitious, Fulgrim had always pursued perfection with zealous intensity. Angron had always been angry. Lorgar had always been a seeker of transcendent truth, and Magnus had always believed that knowledge justified any risk. Chaos did not create these tendencies, but rather fed them until they became all-consuming obsessions that overrode reason and loyalty. The key to fighting chaos-corrupted Astartes was not simply to kill them, but to attack the psychological foundations of their corruption, to create situations where their amplified flaws worked against them rather than for them. At Beta Garmon, the great void battles that would determine whether the traitor advance could continue unimpeded toward Terra, Aethon deployed his legion in a way that exploited every flaw in the traitor force's command structure. He sent false intelligence that suggested the loyalists were weaker than they actually were, baiting Fulgrim's Emperor's children into overextending themselves in pursuit of a glorious victory that would prove their superiority. He leaked information about vulnerable supply convoys that led the World Eaters into ambushes, where their berserker rage prevented them from recognizing the trap until it was too late. He challenged Perturabo's Iron Warriors to break fortifications that appeared weak but were actually reinforced with layers of hidden defenses, turning their siege operations into grinding meat grinders that accomplished nothing but wasting time and resources. The Loyalist forces who witnessed the Argent Wraith's operations initially treated Aethon with suspicion and confusion. Here was a Primarch who should not exist, leading a legion that had no official designation, fighting with tactics and weapons that seemed to have been specifically designed for this exact war, despite the fact that the heresy itself was unprecedented. Rogel Dawn, master of defensive warfare and the stalwart defender of Terra, demanded to know who this newcomer was and why the Emperor had never mentioned him. Aethon's response was simple. He presented Dawn with a sealed data slate that contained nothing but a single line of High Gothic script and the Emperor's personal genetic cipher, a code that could not be forged by any means known to man or Xenos. The message read, "The contingency is active. Trust him." Dawn's trust was not easily given, but he recognized that the Imperium could not afford to reject any advantage when the War Master's forces were less than 2 months from reaching the Sol system. He integrated the Argent Wraiths into the Loyalist command structure, but kept them as a mobile reserve, a strategic asset that could be deployed wherever the traitor advance seemed most likely to break through. Aethon accepted this arrangement without complaint, understanding that Dawn needed time to verify his legitimacy and assess his capabilities. The Primarch of the Argent Wraiths used that time to share intelligence with the Loyalist commanders, providing detailed assessments of traitor legion dispositions and command personalities that proved eerily accurate. When Dawn asked how Aethon knew these things, the forgotten Primarch simply replied that chaos leaves wounds in reality that can be read by those who know how to look. The traitor advance faltered again at Molech, where Horus himself sought to recreate the Emperor's own journey into the warp gates and steal even more power from the dark gods to ensure his victory. The world of Molech had once been important to the Emperor during the Unification Wars and the early days of the Great Crusade, a place where he had made bargains and gained knowledge that allowed him to create the Primarchs in the first place. Horus believed that if he could access that same source of power, he would become unstoppable, a god in truth rather than merely in aspiration. Aethon understood what the War Master intended and recognized it as the pivotal moment when Horus would either ascend to godhood or overreach and destroy himself. The Argent Wraiths descended on Molech with a fury that shocked even the veterans of the heresy's worst battles. They fought not to hold ground or capture objectives, but to simply delay and disrupt, to keep Horus from reaching the warp gate long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The battle was brutal and desperate, with Astartes fighting in the shadow of ancient ruins that predated human civilization on Terra, technology from the dark age of technology mixing with warp sorcery in combinations that defied sanity. Aethon himself confronted Horus in the depths beneath Molech's surface, in a chamber where the warp bled through into reality and the laws of physics became suggestions rather than rules. The duel between the forgotten Primarch and the War Master was not a matter of simple combat prowess, though both were among the most formidable warriors the Imperium had ever produced. It was a battle of wills and psychic might, a contest to see whose vision of humanity's future would prevail. Horus wielded the power of all four Chaos gods, channeling their combined might into attacks that could have erased entire cities from existence. Aethon countered with his unique nature, his existence as a living wound in chaos that disrupted and nullified the warp's energies simply by being present. The clash of their powers created psychic shockwaves that killed every mortal within 10 kilometers instantly, stopping hearts and boiling brains through pure, overwhelming force. Neither Primarch could truly defeat the other in that moment. Horus was too empowered by chaos, too far gone into his transformation to be simply killed by conventional means. Aethon was too resilient, too fundamentally antithetical to chaos to be corrupted or destroyed by warp sorcery. But Aethon did not need to kill Horus. He only needed to deny him the final ascension he sought. When the War Master reached for the ultimate power the Warp Gate offered, Aethon was there to sever the connection, to insert himself between Horus and the Dark Gods, and block the flow of energy that would have completed the transformation. The backlash nearly killed both of them, a psychic explosion that collapsed the ancient chamber and buried the Warp Gate under millions of tons of rubble and molten stone. Horus emerged from Molech changed, but not in the way he had intended. He had gained more power, yes, but he had not achieved the absolute godhood he sought, and the failure gnawed at him. More importantly, he had been forced to recognize that there was a force in the galaxy specifically designed to counter him, a Primarch whose very existence was a strategic counter-move by the Emperor that Horus had not anticipated. The psychological impact of that realization was profound. The War Master had believed himself to be the ultimate betrayer, the son who had outsmarted the father and seized destiny by force. Learning that the Emperor had prepared for his betrayal all along, had hidden an entire contingency plan in the form of a forgotten brother, shattered some of the absolute confidence that had driven Horus's early victories. The traitor advance continued toward terror, but now it did so under the shadow of uncertainty and growing paranoia among the traitor Primarchs. Aethon's interventions had demonstrated that the Loyalists possessed resources and capabilities that the traitors had not accounted for, and that created friction within the heretical coalition. Perturabo resented being denied his victories through what he saw as cheap tricks and subterfuge. Fulgrim grew frustrated that his pursuit of perfection kept leading him into traps. Angron simply wanted to kill everything in his path, but found that the Argent Wraiths refused to meet him in the straightforward melee combat where he excelled. Even Lorgar, the architect of so much of the heresy's ideological foundation, began to question whether the Chaos Gods had been entirely honest about the guaranteed nature of their victory. The Siege of Terra itself began, according to the established histories, with the traitor legions descending on humanity's homeworld in their millions and battering at the walls of the Imperial Palace in an apocalyptic confrontation that would decide the fate of the species. But with Aethon's legion already present and integrated into the defensive plans, the siege unfolded differently than it should have. The Argent Wraiths operated as a rapid response force, moving through the palace's hidden passages and ancient tunnels to hit traitor breaching attempts from unexpected angles, always appearing where they were least expected and vanishing before the traitors could bring overwhelming force to bear. Rogel Dawn's defensive genius combined with Aethon's anti-chaos specialization created a synergy that magnified both Primarch's strengths. Where Dawn built fortifications that could withstand any conventional assault, Aethon warded them against demonic incursion and warp sorcery, creating zones where chaos's supernatural advantages simply ceased to function. The traitors found that their most powerful weapons, the daemons and possessed marines and reality-warping sorcery that had broken so many loyalist defenses, became unreliable and dangerous to use in large sections of the Imperial Palace's defense perimeter. The siege that should have lasted weeks stretched into months as the traitors struggled to overcome defenses that adapted to counter their every tactic. The pivotal moment came when Horus, growing desperate as the siege dragged on and his forces bled themselves white against the palace's walls, made the decision to lower the void shields on his flagship, the vengeful spirit, and bait the Emperor into a final confrontation. In the original timeline, this gambit succeeded in drawing the Emperor, Sanguinius, and Rogel Dawn into a teleporter assault that ended with Sanguinius dead, the Emperor mortally wounded, and Horus slain but victorious in having crippled the Imperium's leadership. In this altered history, Aethon was present for that teleporter assault, standing beside his brothers as they materialized aboard the War Master's flagship. The battles through the vengeful spirit's corrupted corridors remain classified even in the fragments I was able to recover, but certain facts can be pieced together from the psychic echoes and survivor testimonies. Sanguinius fought Horus in single combat as destiny demanded. The Angel and the War Master locked in a duel that embodied the tragedy of brother fighting brother. But before Horus could deliver the killing blow that would have ended the Blood Angel's life, Aethon intervened. The forgotten Primarch did not save Sanguinius through superior combat skill or overwhelming force, but simply by being present, by standing between the Angel and the War Master at the critical instant and disrupting the chaos energies that empowered Horus's killing strike. The War Master's blow still fell, still wounded Sanguinius grievously, but the Angel survived long enough to be evacuated from the vengeful spirit before the final confrontation between Horus and the Emperor began. That single change, that small alteration in the timeline's flow, had cascading consequences. The Emperor arrived to face Horus, already knowing that Sanguinius lived, already aware that the sacrifice had been forestalled by Aethon's intervention. The psychological calculus of the final battle shifted. The stakes changed from a father's vengeance for a murdered son to a father's last attempt to save a corrupted child before it was too late. The Emperor and Horus fought their legendary duel, and the Emperor held back hoping for redemption until he saw through the War Master's eyes and recognized that Horus was too far gone, too consumed by chaos to be saved. The Emperor struck with the full force of his psychic might, obliterating Horus's soul and banishing the Chaos God's hold on his body in a psychic flash that lit up the Imperium like a supernova. But in this timeline, Aethon was also present in that throne room. And when the Emperor expended his power to destroy Horus, the forgotten Primarch was there to absorb some of the backlash, to shield the Emperor from the worst of the psychic feedback that should have left him a broken shell. The Emperor survived the duel, wounded and weakened, but not mortally so. He required healing and time to recover, required being placed in the ancient mechanisms of the Golden Throne to stabilize his psychic essence and prevent it from dissipating into the warp. But he was not reduced to the living corpse that would fuel the Astronomicon for 10,000 years through endless suffering. Instead, the Emperor entered a healing sleep, a dormant state where his psychic powers could regenerate, while the Golden Throne sustained his body and the Astronomicon continued to burn through automated systems and the sacrifices of psychers that had already been established. The Imperium that emerged from the heresy in this altered timeline was fundamentally different from the one we know. Sanguinius survived to lead the Blood Angels through the Scouring and beyond, his wisdom and compassion tempering the rage and vengeance that consumed so many loyalists in the war's aftermath. Rogel Dawn worked alongside Aethon to rebuild Terra and fortify the Imperium against future chaos incursions, combining physical defenses with psychic wards and null field generators that made large-scale demonic invasions nearly impossible in key star systems. Rabute Guilliman's Codex Astartes reforms were implemented, but adapted to account for the existence of Aethon's anti-chaos specialists, creating a new type of Space Marine chapter specifically designed to hunt corrupted Astartes and purge chaos cults before they could metastasize into full rebellions. The Emperor's absence from active rule created a power vacuum, but one that could be filled by his surviving sons rather than by the fossilized theocratic bureaucracy of the Ecclesiarchy and the Administratum. The Primarchs formed a council, a collective leadership that governed the Imperium according to their different strengths and specialties. Guilliman handled administration and civic organization. Dawn managed military defense and fortification. The Lion led offensive crusades against Xenos threats. Vulcan and Corax led humanitarian efforts and covert operations, respectively. And Aethon, The forgotten son, now revealed, took responsibility for humanity's eternal war against chaos itself, leading strike forces into the Eye of Terror and other warp rifts to sabotage demonic incursions and rescue corrupted worlds before they were lost entirely. The Great Rift that would have torn the galaxy in half 10,000 years later never occurred in this timeline, because the Imperium possessed the knowledge and tools to identify and contain the nascent warp storms before they could coalesce into galaxy-spanning catastrophes. Chaos remained a threat, an eternal enemy that humanity would never fully defeat, but it was a manageable threat rather than an existential one. The Imperium expanded more carefully, consolidating its gains rather than pushing recklessly into the galactic hinterlands. Xenos threats like the Tyranid hive fleets and the Necron dynasties still menaced humanity, but they faced an Imperium that was united and led by demigods rather than divided and ruled by bureaucratic inertia. But perfection remained elusive even in this brighter timeline. The Emperor's healing sleep stretched across centuries and then millennia, and as the ages passed, questions arose about whether he would ever truly wake, or if his sons would rule forever in his name. Tensions developed between the Primarchs as their different philosophies and priorities came into conflict without the Emperor's absolute authority to mediate. Guilliman's desire for efficiency clashed with Vulcan's compassion. Dawn's inflexibility frustrated Corax's need for adaptability. Aethan's focus on fighting chaos sometimes left other threats unaddressed until they metastasized into crises. The Imperium remained strong, remained functional, but it was not the paradise that some had hoped would emerge from the heresy's end. The greatest philosophical question that haunted this alternate Imperium was whether humanity had truly won or simply delayed the inevitable. Chaos could not be destroyed, could not be killed or banished permanently, as long as sentient beings existed to feel anger, despair, ambition, and hope. The Emperor had understood this, had designed Aethon as a tool to fight chaos rather than to defeat it, because defeat was impossible against an enemy that was woven into the fabric of consciousness itself. Every victory against the dark gods was temporary. Every daemon banished would eventually return. Every corrupted world saved would eventually face temptation again. The eternal war was truly eternal, a grinding struggle that would never end regardless of how many battles humanity won. Some imperial philosophers and theologians in this altered timeline argued that the Imperium needed the Emperor to wake and lead them to a final transcendent solution, a way to evolve beyond chaos entirely by transforming humanity into something new. Others countered that such transformation was itself a chaos corruption in disguise, that changing humanity's fundamental nature to escape chaos would mean destroying everything that made humanity worth saving in the first place. The debate raged in universities and monasteries, in the halls of the Administratum and the chapels of the Astartes, an endless argument about whether salvation lay in becoming something more than human or in remaining defiantly human no matter the cost. Aethan himself rarely engaged with these philosophical debates, focused as he was on the practical reality of fighting chaos across the galaxy's war zones. But in rare moments of reflection, recorded in his personal logs that I found scattered across multiple archives, the forgotten Primarch expressed a melancholy understanding that his existence was itself evidence of the Emperor's tragic pragmatism. He had been created as a weapon, designed for a specific purpose and hidden away until that purpose could be fulfilled. He was proof that the Emperor had always known betrayal was possible, had always prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. That knowledge shaped Aethan's worldview, made him fundamentally aware that even the Emperor's grand vision for humanity had been built on contingencies and backup plans rather than absolute certainty. The question that consumed Aethon more than any other was what would happen when the Emperor finally woke from his healing sleep. Would his father approve of what his sons had built in his absence? Would he reclaim the throne and return the Imperium to a single autocratic vision? Or would he acknowledge that his sons had proven capable of ruling without him? And perhaps most disturbingly, what if the Emperor woke and decided that Aethon's purpose had been fulfilled, that the anti-chaos contingency was no longer needed now that the immediate crisis had passed? Would the forgotten Primarch be cast aside once more, returned to obscurity and expunged from the records to maintain whatever new narrative the Emperor deemed necessary? These questions remained unanswered in the fragments I recovered, and perhaps that is fitting. The truth about Aethon, about his intervention in the heresy and the alternate timeline he created, exists in the Imperium's most secured archives as a hypothetical, a wargame scenario that the Emperor's strategists developed during the Primarch project's planning phases. Or perhaps it exists as something more, a genuine record of events that occurred in a parallel reality where one small change cascaded into a completely different future. The Inquisition's Ordo Chronos, those temporal investigators who claim to police threats to the timeline itself, have expunged any references to Aethon with extreme prejudice, hunting down anyone who claims to have knowledge of the 11th Primarch's true fate. The Imperium, you know, the grim darkness of the far future where there is only war, may be nothing but the shadow universe, the bad ending that occurred because Aethon stayed lost and could not intervene. Or perhaps this blood-soaked Imperium of eternal suffering is the real history, and Aethon's intervention is nothing but a fever dream, a story told by heretics who cannot accept that there was never any hope of a better outcome. The truth has been buried so deep that excavating it would require tearing down the foundations of the Imperial Cult itself, questioning every fundamental assumption about how the heresy ended and why the Emperor sits entombed on the Golden Throne. What I know with certainty is that the Imperium's official history contains gaps and inconsistencies that historians are forbidden from investigating too closely. The records of the Siege of Terra include references to defensive operations that succeeded despite overwhelming odds, traitor advances that failed for no clear tactical reason, and loyalist commanders who reported receiving strategic intelligence from sources they could not or would not identify. Rogel Dawn's personal logs, sealed beneath the Imperial Palace and accessible only to the chapter masters of the Imperial Fists, reportedly contain multiple references to the 11th's contribution and Aethon's intelligence proving accurate once more in the final days of the siege. Sanguinius's death is recorded as occurring aboard the Vengeful Spirit, but medical records from the Blood Angel's apothecarian include notes about treating the Primarch's wounds after the siege's conclusion, wounds that should have been immediately fatal but somehow were not. The most damning evidence I found was a fragment of a conversation recorded by a servitor's damaged memory core, recovered from the ruins of the Imperial Palace's inner sanctum. Two voices, both bearing the psychic resonance of Primarchs, speaking in the immediate aftermath of Horus's death. One voice, identified through vocal analysis as Rogel Dawn, says, "He knows what must be done. The Imperium cannot know about him, cannot know that Father prepared for this. It would destroy their faith." The second voice, unidentified in Imperial records but possessing the same fundamental psychic signature as all the Emperor's sons, responds, "I understand. I will return to the shadows, and history will forget I was ever here. But the wards will remain, and my sons will watch for Chaos's return." The conversation ends there, and the servitor's memory core contains nothing else of value, but those few words suggest a conspiracy at the highest levels of the Imperium to erase Aethon from history even after he had saved Terra itself. Why would the Primarchs agree to such an erasure? The answer lies in understanding the psychology of faith and the foundations of imperial authority. The Emperor had presented himself as infallible, as a being of such transcendent genius that he could foresee and plan for every possibility. The Horus Heresy shattered that image, revealed that the Emperor's sons could be corrupted, and that his grand vision could be derailed by forces he had underestimated. But if the Imperium learned that the Emperor had prepared for his son's betrayal, had hidden Aethon as a contingency plan against that exact scenario, it would confirm that the Emperor had always known his children might fail him. That knowledge would undermine the Imperial Cult's foundation, would transform the Emperor from an infallible god into a pragmatic architect who prepared for failure because he could not guarantee success. The erasure of Aethon was necessary to maintain the myth, to preserve the illusion that the Emperor's suffering on the Golden Throne was a noble sacrifice rather than the result of a gambit that nearly failed, despite his best preparations. The Imperium needed to believe that the heresy was an unforeseeable tragedy, a betrayal so profound that even the Emperor could not predict it, because that narrative preserved the divine mystery around his nature. Revealing Aethon would have destroyed that narrative, would have made the Emperor's long war against chaos look less like divine plan and more like desperate improvisation. And yet the wards remained. Across the Imperium, hidden in the foundations of forge worlds and shrine worlds and fortress monasteries, there exist psychic barriers and null field generators whose designs do not match any known standard template construct or Mechanicus pattern. These wards activate during demonic incursions and chaos cult uprisings, creating zones where the warp's influence is diminished and corrupted individuals find their powers failing at critical moments. The Inquisition attributes these phenomena to the Emperor's lingering psychic influence radiating from the Golden Throne, but the patterns are too precise, too specifically targeted to be simple ambient psychic energy. Someone designed these wards with intimate knowledge of how chaos corruption operates and how to counter it at the metaphysical level. Someone who understood the enemy because they had been created specifically to fight it. The Argent Wraiths, if they still exist, operate under different names and heraldry now, scattered across the Imperium as specialized chapters whose origins are listed as forgotten or records lost in the official registries. They recruit from the same genetic lineages, display the same tactical preferences for rapid strikes against chaos targets, and possess the same unusual resistance to warp corruption that made their progenitor legion so effective. But they claim descent from various loyalist Primarchs, maintaining the fiction that Aethon never existed while continuing his mission across the millennia. Some inquisitors who specialize in hunting chaos have noted that these mysterious chapters seem to appear during major demonic incursions with suspicious regularity, often possessing intelligence about the enemy that should be impossible to obtain through conventional means. The galaxy today stands on the knife's edge, with the Great Rift splitting the Imperium in half, and chaos pouring through in unprecedented quantities. Rabute Guilliman has returned from his long stasis, reborn to lead the Imperium through its darkest hour since the heresy itself. But Guilliman leads an Imperium that followed the darker timeline, the history where Aethon did not intervene and the Emperor was entombed for 10,000 years while his realm slowly rotted from within. Perhaps in that alternate history I pieced together, the brighter future where Aethon's intervention changed everything, the galaxy would not face these crises because the Imperium possessed the tools and knowledge to prevent them. Or perhaps chaos would have found different ways to strike, different vulnerabilities to exploit, and the eternal war would have continued regardless of which Primarch survived and which fell. The philosophical implications of Aethon's hypothetical intervention extend beyond simple military outcomes. If the Emperor truly created a Primarch specifically designed as a contingency against chaos corruption, it suggests that he understood the fundamental flaw in his grand design from the very beginning. The Primarch project was always vulnerable to the warp's influence, always susceptible to the same corrupting forces that the Emperor himself fought against throughout his long existence. Creating Aethon was an admission of that vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement that even the Emperor's greatest creations might turn against him. That admission, if known to the Imperium at large, would fundamentally alter how humanity understands its relationship with the divine and with chaos itself. The current Imperial doctrine teaches that chaos is an external force, an alien corruption that invades from outside and must be resisted through faith and purity. But Aethon's existence and purpose suggest a different understanding. Chaos is inherent to the psychic nature of consciousness itself, woven into the fabric of sentient thought in ways that make it impossible to simply reject or ignore. The Emperor created Aethon not to destroy chaos but to manage it, to contain it, to prevent it from overwhelming humanity while acknowledging that complete victory was never possible. That is a far more subtle and disturbing philosophy than the black and white morality that the ecclesiarchy preaches across the Imperium's million worlds. In the alternate timeline where Aethon intervened successfully, the Imperium would have faced a different set of challenges over the subsequent millennia. Without the Emperor's constant psychic guidance from the Golden Throne, without his suffering serving as a focal point for religious devotion, the Imperial Cult would have developed differently, or perhaps not at all. The Primarchs ruling in council might have maintained the imperial truth, the secular philosophy that denied the existence of gods and treated the warp as a natural phenomenon to be understood and controlled, rather than a supernatural evil to be feared and hated. That philosophical foundation would have produced a very different Imperium, one more aligned with the Emperor's original vision, but perhaps more vulnerable to subtle chaos corruption, precisely because it lacked the fanatical religious fervor that makes current imperial citizens so resistant to heretical ideas. The trade-off between rationality and faith is one that the Emperor struggled with throughout the Great Crusade, and Aethon's intervention would not have resolved that fundamental tension. A rational Imperium armed with anti-chaos technology and led by Primarchs who understood the enemy's true nature might have been more effective at preventing large-scale rebellions and demonic incursions. But such an Imperium would also lack the billions of faithful citizens whose prayers and devotion create a psychic bulwark against chaos in the warp itself, whose unwavering belief in the Emperor's divinity generates enough psychic energy to manifest living saints and other phenomena that even the Mechanicus cannot fully explain. Faith, for all its problems and excesses, provides a form of protection that pure rationality cannot replicate. Aethon himself would have grappled with this paradox throughout his existence. His nature as an anti-chaos weapon gave him unique insight into how the warp operates and how belief shapes reality within the Immaterium. He would have seen firsthand how faith in the Emperor created genuine psychic effects, how the fervent prayers of billions could manifest as tangible force against demonic entities. Yet he would also have understood that the Imperial Cult's dogmatism and fanaticism caused immense suffering, that the ecclesiarchy's power often led to purges and witch hunts that killed innocents and alienated entire populations. Walking the line between encouraging useful faith and preventing destructive fanaticism would have been one of Aethon's greatest challenges in the millennia following the heresy. The other Primarchs in this alternate timeline would have had their own complicated relationships with their forgotten brother. Those who knew the Emperor's plans and understood Aethon's purpose might have resented him as the favored son, the one held in reserve while they bore the burden of the Great Crusade and the heresy's horrors. Rogel Dawn, who prided himself on being the Emperor's Praetorian and the ultimate defender of terror, might have felt diminished by the revelation that another brother had been designated as the true failsafe against catastrophe. The Lion, secretive and strategic, might have questioned why he was not trusted with knowledge of Aethon's existence during the Crusade. Guilliman, always focused on efficiency and proper organization, might have been frustrated by the operational complications that arose from having a Primarch and Legion operating entirely outside the normal chain of command. But there would also have been Primarchs who embraced Aethon's return and recognized the value he brought to the Imperium's continued survival. Vulcan, compassionate and focused on protecting humanity above all else, would have seen Aethon as a necessary guardian against the one threat that conventional military force could not adequately address. Corax, who operated in shadows and understood the value of hidden assets, would have appreciated the strategic logic behind keeping Aethon secret until he was needed. Sanguinius, if he survived in this timeline, would have been grateful to the brother who saved his life, and might have formed a particularly close bond with Aethon based on their shared experience of confronting Horus in his final moments. The practical governance of an Imperium ruled by a council of Primarchs would have been extraordinarily complex, potentially unstable, and yet still preferable to the sclerotic bureaucracy that currently rules in the Emperor's name. Each Primarch brought vastly different skills and philosophies to leadership, and without the Emperor's absolute authority to settle disputes, conflicts between them would have been inevitable. The Codex Astartes debates that historically divided Guilliman from Dawn and other brothers would have played out even more intensely in this timeline, with Aethon potentially serving as a moderating voice, given his unique position as someone who had not participated in the Great Crusade's glory days, and thus had no nostalgia for the old Legion structure. Over the centuries and millennia, this Council of Primarchs would have faced the same fundamental problem that all immortal rulers encounter. They do not age, do not die of natural causes, and therefore do not make room for new generations of leadership. The Imperium in this alternate timeline might have stagnated in different ways than the historical Imperium did, with powerful demigods making decisions based on experiences and assumptions from thousands of years in the past, rather than adapting to current realities. Humans working under Primarch leadership would have faced a glass ceiling, knowing that no mortal could ever rise to the highest levels of power as long as the Emperor's sons lived and ruled. That dynamic could have created its own forms of resentment and rebellion, different from chaos corruption but potentially just as destructive to imperial unity. The question of what happened to the traitor Primarchs in this alternate timeline opens another realm of speculation. In the historical timeline, most of the traitor Primarchs survived the heresy and retreated into the Eye of Terror, where they continue to lead demonic invasions and chaos incursions 10,000 years later. But in a timeline where Aethon intervened and weakened Horus's forces throughout the war, where Sanguinius survived to lead the scouring with even greater ferocity than occurred historically, the traitors might have suffered more decisive defeats. Some might have been killed outright rather than escaping into the warp. Others might have been captured and imprisoned in facilities specifically designed by Aethon to contain chaos-corrupted beings, held not for punishment but for study, so that the Imperium could better understand how to prevent future corruption. The fate of Magnus the Red in this alternate timeline particularly invites speculation. Magnus betrayed the Emperor not out of malice but out of arrogance and desperation, trying to warn his father about Horus's betrayal, and instead damaging the Webway project and enabling the demonic invasion that would eventually necessitate the Emperor's confinement to the Golden Throne. In the historical timeline, Magnus fled to the planet of sorcerers and became a daemon prince of Tsienche, his corruption complete. But if Aethon had reached Magnus earlier in the heresy, before the Crimson King's transformation was complete, there might have been a chance for redemption, or at least containment. Aethon's anti-chaos abilities could theoretically sever the connection between Magnus and Tsienche, force the corruption out of the Crimson King's essence, and leave him mortal and diminished, but potentially salvageable. Such a redemption would have been controversial and divisive among the loyalist Primarchs. The Space Wolves, whose own Primarch Leman Russ had been sent to censure Magnus, and whose legion had burned Prospero to ashes, would have opposed any mercy for the Crimson King. But Magnus possessed knowledge about the warp and demonic entities that could prove invaluable in the Imperium's long war against chaos, and Aethon might have argued that destroying that knowledge out of vengeance was a luxury the Imperium could not afford. The debate over what to do with Magnus would have served as a microcosm of the larger philosophical questions facing this alternate Imperium, whether justice or utility should take precedence, whether punishment or pragmatism served humanity's survival better. The technology and knowledge that Aethon possessed, developed during his decades of fighting chaos beyond the Imperium's borders, would have revolutionized the Imperium's defensive capabilities if properly disseminated. Null field generators that could create zones of psychic silence, preventing demonic manifestation and breaking chaos sorcerers' connection to the warp. Genetic therapies that could identify and reverse the early stages of chaos corruption before it became irreversible. Psychological conditioning techniques that strengthened mental resistance to demonic possession without requiring the brutal mind-scrubbing that the Inquisition typically employs. Weapons that killed not just the physical body but damaged the spiritual essence, making it harder for slain daemons to reform in the warp. All of these innovations existed in prototype form within Aethon's legion, and in a timeline where he remained present to lead the Imperium's anti-chaos efforts. They could have been refined and mass-produced. But the dissemination of such knowledge would have created its own dangers. The more the Imperium understood about how chaos operated, the more opportunities existed for that knowledge to be misused or to corrupt those who studied it too deeply. The Inquisition in our timeline enforces brutal ignorance as a defense mechanism, declaring that even knowing about chaos corruption makes one vulnerable to it. Aethon would have had to develop new protocols and institutions to allow controlled study of chaos without enabling corruption, a delicate balance that would require constant vigilance and probably frequent failures. Every researcher who felt a corruption despite precautions would fuel arguments that ignorance was indeed safer than knowledge, that the Emperor's original plan to deny chaos's existence had been wiser than Aethon's approach of studying the enemy openly. The Adeptus Mechanicus would have had a particularly complex relationship with Aethon in this alternate timeline. The Fabricator General and the senior tech priests of Mars had their own secrets about the Dragon of Mars and the true nature of the machine god, secrets that intersected with but remained distinct from the Emperor's agenda. Aethon's anti-chaos technology would have been simultaneously fascinating and threatening to the Mechanicus, representing innovations that did not derive from standard template constructs, but from original research and development, heretical by the strictest interpretation of the cult Mechanicus's doctrines. Yet the Mechanicus would also have recognized the military value of Aethon's work and the potential for new discoveries that could advance their own goals. The tension between doctrinal purity and practical advancement would have created opportunities for cooperation and conflict between Aethon and the Mechanicus throughout the post-heresy period. The Xenos threats facing the Imperium would not have disappeared in this alternate timeline, and in some ways might have become more dangerous. Without the scattering of the Great Crusade's momentum that the heresy caused in our timeline, the Imperium might have pushed deeper into territory claimed by the Orcs, the Eldar, the Necrons, and other species during the early post-heresy period. That aggression could have provoked responses that the Imperium was not prepared for despite its strengthened position. The Eldar, recognizing that humanity under united Primarch leadership posed an existential threat to their remaining craft worlds, might have taken more drastic action to cripple the Imperium before it could consolidate its power. The Necrons, beginning to wake from their long slumber, might have identified the Imperium as the primary obstacle to their plans for galactic reconquest and targeted it accordingly. Aethon's focus on fighting chaos might have left him and his forces unprepared for Xenos threats that operated on completely different principles. His anti-chaos abilities would be useless against Orc-Warg energy, which derives from a psychic gestalt consciousness that has nothing to do with the ruinous powers. His understanding of demonic possession would provide no insight into Necron regeneration protocols or Tyranid synaptic control systems. In a crisis where multiple Xenos threats converged on the Imperium simultaneously, Aethon might have found himself sidelined, his specialized expertise irrelevant to the immediate danger, while Primarchs like Guilliman and the Lion, who excelled at conventional warfare, took the lead. That would have been a humbling experience for a being created to be the ultimate failsafe, discovering that he was only useful against one specific category of threat. The psychological burden of being the forgotten Primarch, deliberately erased from history even after saving the Imperium, would have weighed heavily on Aethon across the millennia. Unlike his brothers, he could not take pride in the legends surrounding his actions or in the loyalty of Space Marine chapters, who proudly claimed descent from him. His greatest accomplishments had to remain secret, his interventions attributed to other heroes or to the Emperor's providence. Every time he succeeded in thwarting a chaos incursion or saving a world from corruption, he had to watch others receive the credit while he returned to the shadows. That kind of existence would test even a Primarch's psychological resilience, potentially breeding resentment or nihilism if Aethon allowed himself to dwell on the injustice of his situation. Yet perhaps Aethon would have found peace in his role, embracing the paradox of being a hero who could never be celebrated. There is a particular kind of nobility in doing what is necessary without any expectation of recognition or reward, in serving a cause larger than oneself without needing validation or glory. If Aethon truly embodied that philosophy, he would have been the most selfless of all the Primarchs. the one who genuinely served humanity rather than his own ego or ambitions. That purity of purpose might have been exactly why the Emperor chose him for this role, recognizing that only a son capable of accepting eternal obscurity could be trusted with the responsibility of being the ultimate contingency. The Emperor's eventual awakening in this alternate timeline, if it occurred, would have been the moment of ultimate reckoning. Imagine the scene: the master of mankind rising from the golden throne after millennia of healing sleep, his psychic powers restored, though perhaps diminished from their previous heights, his consciousness reconnecting with the material universe after so long operating primarily in the warp. His sons gather before him, the surviving Primarchs who have ruled the Imperium in his absence and shaped it according to their combined vision. And among them stands Aethon, the contingency made manifest, the proof that the Emperor had prepared for failure even while proclaiming absolute confidence in success. What would the Emperor say to Aethon in that moment? Would he embrace the forgotten son and praise him for fulfilling his purpose? Would he acknowledge that Aethon's intervention saved not just the Imperium but the Emperor's own life? That without Aethon's presence aboard the vengeful spirit, the confrontation with Horus would have ended with the Emperor's complete destruction? Or would he maintain the fiction, continue to deny Aethon's existence even in private, insisting that the contingency must remain secret for the good of the Imperium? The conversation between them would determine whether Aethon's millennia of service had any meaning beyond tactical utility, whether the Emperor valued his forgotten son as a person or merely as a weapon to be maintained and deployed as needed. The return of the Emperor to active rule would also force a confrontation with the question of what the Imperium had become in his absence. If the Council of Primarchs had maintained something close to the imperial truth, had prevented the rise of the ecclesiarchy, and kept the Imperium relatively secular and rational, the Emperor might approve of their stewardship. But if faith in his divinity had become too widespread to easily suppress, if the psychic phenomenon of imperial saints and miracles had become too useful to dismiss, he would face a dilemma. The Emperor could either embrace his unwanted godhood and accept that humanity needed to believe in divine protection, even if it contradicted his secular philosophy, or he could attempt to dismantle the Imperial Cult and risk causing a schism that could fracture the Imperium as badly as any chaos rebellion. In the darkest possible interpretation of this alternate timeline, the Emperor might wake to discover that he no longer recognizes the Imperium his sons have built, that their compromises and adaptations have created something alien to his original vision. He might decide that the entire edifice needs to be torn down and rebuilt according to the proper principles. Damn the consequences. That would place the Primarchs in an impossible position: obey their father and watch the Imperium collapse into civil war, or refuse his commands and become rebels against the very being they had served their entire existence. Aethon, whose purpose was to save the Imperium from chaos, would face the ultimate irony of having to choose between his father and his mission if the Emperor's return threatened to destroy everything Aethon had worked to preserve. But perhaps the Emperor would surprise everyone by demonstrating growth and wisdom gained from his long communion with the warp during his healing sleep. Perhaps he would acknowledge that his original approach had flaws, that the imperial truth's denial of chaos had left humanity vulnerable in ways he had not anticipated. Perhaps he would recognize that his sons had done better than he could have hoped, that their collective leadership had proven more resilient than his autocratic rule would have been. In that scenario, the Emperor might choose to step back from absolute power, to serve as advisor and guide rather than unquestioned ruler, allowing the Primarchs to continue governing, while he focused on the larger metaphysical battle against chaos in the warp. The ultimate fate of Aethon in any timeline, whether the historical one where he remained lost or the alternate one where he intervened to save the Imperium, circles back to the question of what it means to be a weapon rather than a person. The Emperor created all his sons to fulfill specific purposes, designed each Primarch to excel in particular domains and fill particular roles in the Great Crusade. But most of the Primarchs could tell themselves they were more than just weapons, that they were leaders and warriors and visionaries who happened to serve the Emperor's goals. Aethon could not indulge in that comfortable fiction. He was explicitly created as a contingency, a tool to be deployed only in the worst-case scenario, and his entire existence derived meaning solely from that emergency function. What happens to such a being when the emergency ends, when the crisis has passed and the contingency is no longer needed? Does Aethon continue to exist as a specialized anti-chaos force, eternally hunting daemons and purging corruption until he falls in battle or simply fades away? Does he attempt to find new purpose beyond his original design, to become something more than the contingency and discover who he is when he is not defined by emergency and crisis? Or does he simply accept that his role is temporary, that he was always meant to burn bright and brief like a flare in the darkness, and find peace in the knowledge that his sacrifice saved humanity even if humanity will never remember him? These questions apply not just to Aethon but to the Imperium itself in any timeline. The Imperium was created as a contingency against humanity's extinction, a desperate attempt to unite the species and protect it from the countless threats that infest the galaxy. But contingencies are temporary measures, stopgaps meant to address immediate crises, rather than sustainable long-term solutions. The Imperium in our timeline has persisted for 10,000 years beyond the emergency that necessitated its creation, has calcified into a permanent institution that can no longer remember why it exists or what it was supposed to protect. In the alternate timeline where Aethon intervened and the Emperor survived in better condition, perhaps the Imperium would have had the opportunity to evolve beyond being a mere contingency, to transform into something capable of addressing the deeper causes of the crises it faces, rather than simply reacting to symptoms. Yet the nature of the warp and chaos makes it unclear whether deeper solutions are even possible. As long as sentient beings feel emotions, as long as consciousness exists in forms capable of psychic resonance, the Chaos Gods will exist to feed on those emotions and corrupt those minds. The Emperor's Webway project, if it had succeeded, might have isolated humanity from the warp and prevented chaos corruption, but at the cost of stunting humanity's psychic evolution and making the species permanently dependent on ancient Xenos technology. Aethon's anti-chaos abilities offered a different approach, suppressing chaos influence through active countermeasures rather than isolation. But that too was merely managing the threat rather than eliminating it. The uncomfortable truth is that chaos may be an inherent aspect of consciousness itself, something that cannot be destroyed without destroying sentience, and the best humanity can hope for is eternal vigilance against an enemy that will never stop trying to corrupt and consume it. In this context, Aethon's hypothetical intervention in the heresy matters less as a specific military outcome and more as a symbol of humanity's refusal to accept defeat. The fact that the Emperor prepared a contingency, that he designed a Primarch specifically to save the Imperium if all else failed, demonstrates a fundamental optimism about humanity's chances despite the overwhelming odds. Even in his darkest calculations, even when planning for the worst-case scenario of his own sons betraying him, the Emperor believed that humanity could survive and continue fighting. Aethon embodies that defiant hope, that stubborn insistence on preparing for disaster while working to prevent it, that characteristically human trait of simultaneously expecting the worst and striving for the best. The Imperium, exists in the absence of that hope, in a timeline where the contingency failed or was never deployed, where the Emperor sacrificed everything and still could not prevent the slow decay of his dream into a nightmare of bureaucratic stagnation and religious fanaticism. That Imperium stands as a warning about what happens when contingencies are not prepared, when hope is allowed to die, when the emergency becomes the permanent state of existence and no one can remember what peace would even look like. But the alternate timeline, the possibility that Aethon represents, suggests that other outcomes were possible, that the grimdark future we know is not inevitable but rather the result of specific choices and failures that could have gone differently. Whether Aethon truly existed, whether his intervention actually occurred in some parallel reality or remains nothing but a thought experiment in the Emperor's strategic planning, becomes almost irrelevant in the face of what he represents. He is the ghost of hope in a hopeless universe, The reminder that even the darkest timeline could have been avoided, the nagging question that undermines every attempt to accept the current Imperium's suffering as necessary or inevitable. And that is why the Inquisition hunts any knowledge of him with such ferocity, why the records must be purged and the witnesses silenced. Not because Aethon threatens the Imperium's stability through his existence, but because he threatens it through his absence, through the possibility he represents that everything could have been so much better if only the contingency had worked. The Lost Primarch is lost not because he failed, but because he succeeded in a timeline that never came to pass, or because he succeeded and then was deliberately erased to maintain a useful fiction. Either way, his memory lingers in the gaps and silences of Imperial history, in the inconsistencies and contradictions that historians are forbidden from investigating, in the wards and technologies that exist without explanation. He haunts the Imperium as a reminder of roads not taken and victories not achieved, as the eternal question mark that undermines every claim that the Emperor's suffering and the Imperium's stagnation were necessary and inevitable. And perhaps that is the most Warhammer 40K truth of all, that in the grim darkness of the far future, even hope must be classified as a mimetic hazard and purged from the historical record, lest it inspire dangerous thoughts about how things could have been different. The Imperium cannot afford hope, cannot risk allowing its citizens to believe that alternatives exist or that the current suffering might have been avoidable. And so Aethon, whether he existed or not, must remain forever lost, forever forgotten, forever the unsung victor of a war that ended differently in a universe that might have been.